So in the last video, we looked at this notion, this theory that there could either be genres that are Platonic ideals that exist already out there, or that they are perhaps something that changes, that is descriptive rather than a proscriptive perfect version somewhere. So um, where do these genres come from? So this is what Stam says. So practitioners and the general public make use of their own genre labels, so de facto genres. So that's quite apart from those of academic theorists. So we might well, therefore, ask ourselves, whose genre is it anyway? So that's the thing to remember. It doesn't matter what the academic theorists say. You know, the scholars can be sitting in universities, doing their well, they won't be sitting in universities, they'll be sitting at home in front of their screens doing their Zoom recordings. But you know, that they might be writing about film theory, or they might be writing about literary theory, you know, media theory, and talking about genres. And they might be making all of these assumptions and sort of prescribing, oh well, an action genre should look like this and horror should look like that, and so on. It really doesn't matter, though, if that's not what the general public are using. You know, the general public, us, because we are all part of the general public, we will actually talk about different genres anyway. And, you know, it may be that we will hear from, as it says, practitioners. So it could be film directors, film producers, and actors, and publicity people, the media, who tell us, oh, yes, you know, this is a great new genre of film, you know, that we're seeing, that is the buddy film, for example, you know, the cop buddy film, or the female friend film, or whatever. So we quite often hear those sorts of new genres being described in the media when films come out and when novels come out. So this is what Stam goes on to explain, that actually that we can have these things going on. So we can have an extension of the genre. So, you know, the label itself may be quite narrow, or it might be quite broad, so it can get extended. We might also have this idea of normativism. So we might have preconceived ideas for criteria for genre membership. So, for example, we might already think, well, in order to be a horror movie, it must always be dark. But if you saw, and I have to admit I haven't seen it because I don't like horror movies after having talked about them, but you know, if you saw the film, I think it came out last year or maybe the year before, Midsummer, that is all in broad daylight, but apparently is terrifying, which is why I won't watch it. I don't like to be frightened. Oh, this year has been so much fun. Anyway, and then we could also have these monolithic definitions. So, you know, as if something only belonged to one genre. So, for example, that you can only be frightened in horror movies. Well, that's not true. Because we have thrillers, and the whole point of a thriller is that you are thrilled, and that thrill might come from being frightened or shocked. We often also have even things like romances, you know, will have some sort of element sometimes of, you know, horror even. So you might have something that's quite bloodthirsty in the middle of a romance film or a romance novel. So, you know, there are certain things that we might think that can only appear in X genre, when actually an awful lot of genres cut across, and we have mixing up of different genres. And also, we might take this view, this biologism view, so a kind of essentialism in which genres are seen as evolving through a standardized life cycle. So, you know, when the genre starts, oh, it's very simple, it's got X, Y, and Z in it. But as it progresses, as it evolves, it starts to draw upon other things. And, you know, and then it sort of, it changes into a brand new genre. Well, that might be the case, and this is certainly what Stam puts forward. And like the James Monaco book that I mentioned, How to Read a Film, Stam is worth looking at, particularly when it comes to genres and film genres, because Stam writes in a very sort of simple, straightforward way. But don't forget Daniel Chandler, because Daniel Chandler is the very much the well-known authority on genres and genre theory. So, thinking about genres and how they perhaps change or evolve or combine. So, we've got these two fairly recent titles. So, the one on the left is the film poster for the film Cowboys and Aliens. Well, you wouldn't think that we could possibly have a genre that combines cowboys, which sort of brings to mind the history of America and notions of the Wild West. And of course, let's not forget that when it comes to something like the whole idea of cowboys, the reality was far, far removed from the Hollywood version of events. So, if we look at cowboy movies from the sort of the 1930s right through till almost the modern day of cowboy movies, but certainly, that high period of cowboy movies of, say, the 1940s and 50s, cowboys from those films are all white and are they have certain elements in the film which, but certainly the fact that they're all white and men, that's something that we would be perhaps inclined to think, well, that's how it must have been. But actually, the reality was that cowboys, a large number of them, were actually black and, African Americans, and a very different version of events. So the reality doesn't always match up to what we get told in the media, and in this case in film. And of course, there are lots and lots of different reasons for that. So, it's about then looking at the context of why stories were told in that way and why the genre looks the way that it does. And, as we see in this particular film poster, the notion of then bringing aliens into any exchange with cowboys, does that make it a historical movie because it deals with cowboys, or does it make it science fiction because it's got aliens in it? I have to admit I haven't seen it, partly because of the title. The title actually puts me off completely, because I think it sounds like it's going to be rubbish, which actually surprisingly would mean generally I would watch it. But on this particular occasion, I haven't seen it. I must put it on my to watch list. Okay, and then we have a fairly recent development in literary novels, if we can call them this, but we can call them literary novels. That whole notion of what is literary as a genre is always under question. So here we have a retelling of a Jane Austen novel of Pride and Prejudice and zombies. And Pride and Prejudice and other Jane Austen novels have sort of had this treatment, and it brings, of course, an entirely new audience to Jane Austen books, but also to the zombie genre too. So you will be drawing upon two completely disparate, perhaps, groups. So groups of people who love Jane Austen, and groups of people who love zombie stories, and they are then combined. And of course, this one has also been turned into a film, and the film itself shows quite clearly that by combining this period story a period drama of Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, combining that with very much more a contemporary type of story that deals with zombies, because zombies have been quite fashionable over the last few years. By combining those two together, you end up with an action adventure movie. So, that again is quite interesting, that suddenly that leads on to a different genre. So one thing that we can look at and begin to perhaps help us to understand this is that what we might be seeing is family resemblances. So this is from Swales, as it says, from 1990. So contemporary theorists tend to describe genres in terms of family resemblances among texts. So, and that's taken from Wittgenstein, rather than completely defining things. So instead of being prescriptive and saying, a particular genre has to have these different elements, instead, what we can do is look at family resemblances. So we can actually say, these different types of texts all have this particular aspect. And we can then perhaps fit things in to maybe a multiple different list of genres. So as it says, an individual text within a genre rarely, if ever, has all the characteristic features of the genre. We can't really pin them down like that. Some will have, so some horror films will be in the daylight instead of the dark. Some horror films will have monsters or vampires. Some will have something unseen. Some horror films will have blood and guts and gore, others won't. Some horror movies might rely heavily upon music, to set the tone of things and to make us feel certain things. Others may not do that. So, there are lots and lots of different aspects, family resemblances, that can then be drawn upon. So the family resemblance approach, this involves the theorist illustrating the similarities between some of the texts within a genre. So in other words, what you would do is, if you were writing about a particular genre, you might say that maybe these 3 different texts all have a romance in them, which means that in some respects they are part of the romance genre, but they also have, this one has X, this other text has Y, and this other text has Z, which means that they don't all completely fit in, but instead we can actually look at the texts themselves. So instead of going from a proscriptive, this is what they ought to have, we can do a descriptive. We can actually look at the texts themselves and then begin to draw out those similarities. However, David Lodge, cited in Swales, he criticises this because he says that no choice of a text for illustrative purposes is innocent. So in other words, the person writing who is trying to illustrate their particular point will choose particular texts because they are biased towards them. And they will choose texts that will make their argument. Of course they will, because we want to make our point. So of course, if we're trying to make a point, we are going to pick things that answer our question. And such theories can make any text seem to resemble any other one. So yes, there are drawbacks to taking this family resemblances approach, so a more descriptive approach. So let's have a look at a little bit more about genres. So for example, this is a recent TV show that hasn't ever been shown on UK terrestrial TV for political reasons. So if you've come across it, it's on Amazon Prime. It's called Outlander. It's based on a series of, I think there are about 8 or 9 novels that tell the story of this 1940s nurse who manages to slip back through time into Scotland of the the uprisings back in the 1700s. So, so the uprisings against the Jacobite uprisings against the English king. And so this covers a number of different genres. There is a romance at the heart of it because the nurse falls in love with a young Scotsman. So that actually sort of runs through all of the novels, and is, as I say, the sort of the central plot theme. But we also have this notion of it being sort of vaguely science fiction because there's time travel. And also, it's historically correct, the novels. Now, I don't mean historically correct from the point of view of, oh, there's time travel in it, and I somehow know that time travel really exists. Not that, that's the science fiction bit. But no, instead, it's historically correct as far as the different events in both of the time settings. So the Jacobite uprising, the Jacobite rebellion, and the various different battles, they are retold in the novel historically correctly. So all of that's going on. So this TV show and the novels then draws on at least these three different genres, and also it's a massive sort of adventure action type story as well. So it means that people who like romances, people who like historical fiction, people who like time travel science fiction stories, and people who like action adventure stories could all be drawn to this. Um, so it's a mishmash of different genres, but it works and it has millions of fans all over the UK. Okay, so let's move on from that one. So going back to Chandler, so this is what Chandler actually talks about, and he's actually referencing Bordwell, who's also written quite a bit about genre, and particularly in film. Boris Tomaszewski insists that no firm logical classification of genres is possible. Their demarcation is always historical. That's to say, it is correct only for a specific moment of history. So that's where I said that, if we look back at horror movies from, say, the 70s or the 1930s, or sort of the 20th century. If we look at horror movies or horror novels of the 20th century, they tend to be far more sort of self-contained, if you like, by comparison to horror movies and novels of the 21st century. So it's specific to that moment of history. And that's where we have things like uh, alien abduction movies, and aliens and space travel and so on were a very popular genre in America of the 50s and 60s. And that ties into what was happening in America, politically, and the worldwide situation of the Cold War. So that fits with that particular genre being popular. More recently, we have seen a huge rise in zombie movies and zombie stories. So, evidently there are elements in our culture, our present day global culture, that really resonates to this notion of zombies. Um, what that is, well, you can perhaps make your own minds up about that, and what it is that's fed into our love of current love of zombie stories. So we can map all of these and link them together. So, we can have different versions of, as it says, thrillers and comedies, and action drama, and romantic drama, and they still connect to one another. And there are threads through all of these, and literally a brand new genre is only just around the corner all the time. but it is definitely sort of bound to periods in history. And, something is fashionable for a while, and then it goes out of fashion for a while, whether that's in publishing or in films. So we've got some some definitions here to do with genre. So we can look at the narrative when we're thinking about genre, and we can see that sometimes, as it says, it's sometimes formulaic. There'll be particular plots, particular predictable situations. There will be characters that we are used to seeing, quite often stereotypical. If we think about sort of teenage slasher movies from the 80s and 90s, quite often these would take place in a summer camp, and they were all, at least out in the woods, or maybe in a big house, but somewhere isolated. There would be a group of kids, and of course there would always be somebody who would go off on their own, and you knew almost from the beginning that whichever characters were still virgins, if they maintained that purity, that would mean that they would survive. It was almost as simple as that as soon as you had anyone who was sexually active, you could pretty much guarantee they're dead. They are toast in a moment. And this idea of certainly who is going to survive and who will end up within the death toll was played around with in TV shows and novels like Game of Thrones. But anyway, so you can see there are other things here that we can look at when we're considering genres. So we have tropes, or we could say schemas, of different genres. And, we have this cartoon here. So you're saying there's a crazy serial killer trying to kill us. Yes, and he can easily pop out of nowhere and kill us if we are alone. Well, in that case, we should totally split up. That's a really, really common trope, common sort of part of our expectations, our schema of horror movies. We absolutely expect that at some point the people will do the wrong thing. They will go down into the cellar where there's no light. They will split up. They will get up during the night and go and explore and find out what that noise was. Whereas in reality, most of us would be hiding under the covers, and if we've got our mobile phone, we'd be dialing 999. We would not be saying, "Oh, I'm going to go and find out what that was." We just wouldn't. But somebody hiding under the covers all night until, the creepy thing went away doesn't really make a good plot, and it doesn't make a good story, and it certainly doesn't make a good film or a good suspenseful novel. So, what we would do in real life is often quite dull. That's the thing to remember. So another person that we should be looking at and thinking about when it comes to genre is Roland Barthes. And one of his books, SZ, he actually looks at different codes of understanding a particular text. So, these are almost like different lenses that we can use to analyse a text. We can look through these different lenses and understand what's going on. So Roland Barthes talks about genre and reader response, but it's absolutely, as it says there, in relation to other texts within the genre, rather than in relation to our own lived experience, that we understand texts. So, we read a horror novel or a thriller or whatever, and we understand it in relation to other texts from that genre. So we have these 5 codes that Roland Barthes established, and here they are: hermeneutic, proerectic, semantic, symbolic, and cultural. So we're going to go through them fairly quickly, but don't forget all of these slides are available on Moodle. So if you decide that you're going to do this particular essay question, you may want to use Roland Barthes' 5 codes. So the hermeneutic code I'm not going to read all that text. The thing, you can read it yourselves. The thing to remember with the hermeneutic code is that word hermeneutic and hermeneutics is essentially analysis. So this is something that we do. We carry out hermeneutics when we perhaps don't understand what's going on in the text. And I don't mean that we don't understand it because we don't understand the language or we think that we're not intelligent enough to make sense of it. It's not that. It's that there is some sort of mystery. And so that means that we need to interrogate the text. We need to start asking questions of the text and working out how to analyse it. You know, what's going on here? You know, why have these people behaved like that? You know, why is this written in this way? So we can actually begin to ask questions of it. We can carry out hermeneutics. So it's about interpreting the text. And, you know, we can do that, of course, with conspiracy theories. And again, you know, I will leave you to, if you wish to, pause the video here and you can actually read that that conspiracy theory about the mass shooting that happened in 2017 in Vegas. So then we have the proerectic code. So this is about action. And what happens. So, you know, we might be looking at the verbs and the actions of what happens in the story. So, you know, we might be asking questions in the hermeneutic code, but if we were examining the proerectic code, we would simply be looking at, oh, well, character leaves here, goes there, does this, says that, and so on. So the action. So that ties into our expectations. You know, it builds interest, suspense, because we're thinking to ourselves, if they have got on a plane, they're going to get off the plane, that sort of thing. We've got an anticipated idea of what will happen with the action. And of course, that fits in really well to the idea of schema and the idea of genres, that, you know, we would expect certain things to happen, certain events to unfold. So, for example, if you were a fan of Game of Thrones, you might remember that at the end of the penultimate season, one of the main characters, Jon Snow, appeared to die. And that then left viewers very much situated in hermeneutics and using a hermeneutic code to try and work out what was going on. And, you know, the internet was awash with different theories as whether or not Jon Snow had actually died. And of course, we know that George R.R. Martin, who wrote the novels of Game of Thrones and still hasn't finished writing them, you know, he is renowned for killing off our favourite characters. But also, he's not above bringing them back. So that's something else that, you know, we were then sort of left thinking, well, we know that this character's being killed. Is he staying dead? Or, because we know that there are zombies of sorts in these novels, is he going to come back? And in which case, how is that going to happen? So we have the proerectic code, where we're working out expectations of what might happen in the action, mixed in with hermeneutics and working out, you know, trying to analyse and make sense of the mystery that is inherent in the story. So then we have also this semantic code, and this, of course, is down to the words, and it's where we might have sort of a play on words or something, well, semantic connotations. So words that mean multiple things, but not just words, elements of the story that could be actually read or understood in a variety of different ways, depending on their connotations. So, for example, this George Carlin joke: in some company, it's perfectly all right to prick your finger, but very bad form to finger your prick. So, of course, we've got a double entendre going on there. We've got different meanings for the word prick and also the word finger. So, you know, multiple meanings depending on context and those additional connotations. And, you know, that's something that's used quite heavily in humour, and particularly humour aimed at adults. So then we also have this symbolic code. Now, the symbolic code and the semantic code can be sometimes a little hard to understand because Roland Barthes isn't terribly clear, but other people have written more extensively about this, and essentially what various other people, and you can see that we have here some other sort of references, but you know, if you were to go and look up the symbolic code with Roland Barthes, you'll find quite a lot of scholars subsequently have uh, sort of clarified things, and we can take the symbolic code to be more sort of the symbols and themes, if you like, rather than individual words. So it's not, the semantic code is more about how words might have multiple meanings. The symbolic code might be a bit like when we looked at register and style, that we have quite often different roles that we play. So, you know, symbols that, you know, we, depending on how we're dressed, for example, that means something different. So, for example, going back to Game of Thrones again, we have this character of Cersei, and you know, at the beginning of the story, she has this long hair, and she's very much wife and mother, and you know, has a sort of far gentler costume. And then later on, towards the very end of the TV series, she has short hair, which, you know, sort of within the context of the show, is very much seen as being far more masculine. And her outfit is, you know, is a dark colours and almost like armour. So, you know, she is no longer wife and mother. That softness has gone, and instead she's very much ruler. So, you know, these are the symbolic codes from just looking at how she's dressed, how her hair is done, and so on. But we could also say even things like how the photograph has been taken, how in the second, the photograph on the right, she's looking directly at us, and that's far more adversarial, whereas the photograph on the left is catching her sort of three-quarter face on, you know, not direct on, and her head seems to be slightly tilted, you know, and she looks much more approachable. So then we also have the last of the 5 codes is this cultural code, and this is absolutely stuff that people within a certain culture already know. So it's a shared knowledge, things that we don't have to explain. So, and it could be things like cliches, proverbs, and so on. So, like this. So, old people at weddings always poke me and say, "You're next." So, I started doing the same thing to them at funerals. So, that completely goes against those cultural codes, because we know that, you know, at weddings, yes, people will say, "You're next," implying, of course, that you're going to be the next one to get married. But you don't say that at a funeral, because then, of course, that implies that they are going to be the next one to die. So, you know, it's against our cultural codes, absolutely. It's not the way to behave. So Roland Barthes explains that all of these codes we can use to understand what we're reading, and actually by extension what we're seeing, and they, each of them will be, perhaps to a lesser or greater extent, will be present in different genres or any text, but we can use it to help us understand a particular text. And we end up with this braid. So, you know, this weave of different voices, each of those codes being a different voice, and we can begin to understand what we're seeing and understand how this particular text works, and does it fit into a particular notion of a genre. Okay, to sum up, and I realise that this last video has been particularly long, So apologies for that, but it's quite a lot to get through and to try and explain it all. So to sum up, we understand texts based upon our previous experiences. So that's the schema theory, that we already have these architectures in our brains that allow us to sort of slot these ideas and these experiences into them. And then we keep on building upon them as our experiences broaden and we take on more knowledge and more information. So genres aren't something fixed that exist in some sort of cabinet on the top of Mount Olympus or anywhere else. Instead, they absolutely reflect the period in time. So, you will find certain genres at certain times in history, and sometimes they will change their name, or they will go through an alteration. So they are constantly evolving, if you like, but they absolutely reflect particular periods in time. And then we can actually begin to examine genres and texts in a number of different ways. And Roland Barthes' 5 codes from SZ can be a really useful method for actually looking at texts, not just for genres, but for looking at texts anyway. Roland Barthes' codes, 5 codes, are extremely useful. And that finishes it for this week. So do now go and have a look at some of what Roland Barthes wrote about the 5 codes, but also have a look at some of the other writing from other people, from other scholars. So as I said in the last video, go and have a look at the library, go and look on the search facility on their website, but also don't overlook things as well like Google Scholar. If you put in Roland Barthes' 5 codes, you'll get lots of people talking about it, as I say, particularly on Google Scholar, but also with the library search function too. So have a look at those, and also have a look further at this notion of genre, and how we can begin to identify different genres and how we can analyse them in any form of text. And don't forget that notion of text is beyond just the printed text. If we're thinking about media, remember back to the first week, media is more than just the press or a newspaper, and it's more than just one mode of words on a page. It's multiple modes of image, moving image, and so on. And I will see you in the seminars next week.